blood was still drying on the knuckles of the most dangerous man in Toronto when the orderly dropped his tray. The private wing of St. Cornelius Medical Center had never hosted anything quite like Riker Malone at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. The suite, reserved for the city's quietly powerful, the ones whose names appeared on hospital donor walls but never in court records, smelled of fresh lilies and institutional dread. Riker sat on the edge of the adjustable bed, IV line dangling uselessly from his arm, 2 broken monitors on the floor, and a very young orderly named Kyle pressed flat against the wall like wallpaper. Security had been called. Security had arrived. Security had taken one look at Riker Malone and decided they had families to go home to. The charge nurse on duty, a cautious man named Bertram, stood at the doorway and said nothing. He had worked at St. Cornelius for 19 years. He recognized the Malone name the moment it appeared on the intake form. Everyone in Toronto recognized the Malone name, the same way everyone recognized a storm warning on the radio. You didn't argue with it. You waited for it to pass and counted what it hadn't destroyed. I said. Riker's voice was low and perfectly controlled, which was somehow more frightening than shouting, "Get this needle out of my arm and get me a phone." My phone, not a hospital phone. Mine. Kyle, who was 22 and had only been working this shift for 3 months, tried again. "Mr. Malone, your arm has a hairline fracture," and the doctor said. Riker stood up. He wasn't especially tall, maybe 6'1", but he moved the way certain animals moved, with a compressed energy that made the room feel smaller. His left arm was in a temporary splint. His right was fine, and the look on his face suggested he planned to use it. Kyle pressed harder against the wall. Bertram reached for his radio. And Neve Callard, who had just come off a 6-hour shift in the main ER, and was walking through the private wing on her way to the parking garage, looked in through the open doorway and sighed so hard her shoulders dropped 2 inches. She had $47 in her bank account. Her brother Matteo owed $16,000 to people who didn't send polite reminder notices. Her feet had been hurting for 4 hours. She had not eaten since noon. She was not, by any definition, in the mood. "Kyle," Neve said, stepping into the room, "go get a warm blanket from the warmer down the hall. The good ones, not the scratchy ones." Kyle looked at her like she had suggested he jump out the window instead. "Go," she said, and something in her voice made him scramble out the door with visible relief. Neve set her bag down on the visitor's chair, crossed her arms and looked at Riker Malone directly. This was the part most people didn't do. They looked at his left shoulder, or the space past his ear, or the floor. Neve looked at his face. He had dark eyes, a jaw like a topographic map of a mountain range, a cut above his left eyebrow that had been poorly cleaned by whoever had patched him up before admission. His knuckles, the ones with the dried blood, told a story she didn't need explained. "You pulled out your IV," Neve said, "which means your line sight is bleeding under that tape. You've got a fracture in your radius that is going to shift into something much uglier if you keep tensing that arm, and you frightened Kyle, who is a good kid who did not deserve to be in this room tonight." Riker stared at her. "Sit down," she said. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. "Do you have any idea?" he began. "I know exactly who you are," Neve said. "Riker Malone. Your family's name is on the oncology wing on the 3rd floor. Doesn't mean I let you bleed on my linens." She walked to the supply cabinet on the wall, opened it and pulled out gloves and a fresh IV kit. "Sit down." He sat. She wasn't sure which of them was more surprised by that. She reinserted the IV line with the efficiency of someone who had done it 800 times. She cleaned the cut above his eye without asking permission. She didn't make small talk. She worked the way she always worked, quickly, precisely, with zero interest in performance. "You're not scared of me," Riker said. He didn't say it like an accusation. He said it like someone reading a word in a foreign language, testing whether they had it right. "I did a clinical placement in the downtown core ER when I was 23, Neve replied, pressing a clean bandage over the cut. "Saturdays. You want to talk about scary, talk to me about a Saturday night in that ER." She stepped back. "The fracture needs proper imaging. You should let them X-ray it." "I've had worse fractures." "I believe you. You should still let them X-ray it." He looked at her for a long moment. She didn't look away. "Fine," Riker said. Bertram, who had been standing in the doorway this entire time, quietly leaned against the doorframe in relief. The consequences came 48 hours later. Neve was in her apartment on Gerrard Street East, sorting through a stack of envelopes with the grim focus of someone defusing a bomb. The rent, the hydro, the notice from the collection agency that had taken over Matteo's debt account. She had been making the same calculation for 3 months, moving money from one hole to another, never quite plugging all of them at once. The knock at her door was 3 slow, measured raps. Niamh looked up from the table. She'd lived in this apartment long enough to know every knock. Her neighbor, Mrs. Ferraro, knocked fast and light. The super knocked twice and said his name. This knock was neither of those things. She looked through the peephole. 2 men in dark coats stood in the hallway. They were large in the way that architectural columns were large, structural and permanent. Between them stood an older man leaning on a cane, its handle carved into the shape of an eagle's head. Carmine Malone was in his late 60s. He looked like he'd been assembled from the same material as the Canadian shield, grey, intractable, and older than anything around him. His eyes were sharp and colourless as lake water in November. Niamh undid the chain. "Miss Callard, may I come in?" "You're going to anyway," she said, stepping back. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had not been surprised in 20 years. He walked in, and his men stayed in the hall, and he looked around her apartment the way you looked at a map before a long drive, taking it in, cataloguing. He looked at the envelopes on the table. He looked at the photograph of Niamh and Matteo on the wall, taken at Niagara Falls 3 summers ago, before Matteo's problem started. He looked at her the way a person looked at something they had already decided they needed. "My son came home from the hospital," Carmine said, lowering himself into the chair by the window without being invited, and did not put his fist through a single wall. This has not happened after a hospital visit in 4 years. Niamh said nothing. He also, apparently, allowed an X-ray. Carmine folded both hands over the top of his cane. "My son has not voluntarily allowed an X-ray since 2019. He fractured 2 ribs in 2022 and refused imaging for 6 weeks. He paused. He told me. And I want you to understand how rarely this happens, that a nurse told him to sit down and he sat." "He was in pain," Niamh said. "People in pain are easier to talk to than people looking to prove something." Carmen looked at the envelopes again. He didn't lean forward to read them. He didn't need to. She suspected he already knew what they said. "I am going to make you an offer, Miss Callard. It will seem absurd. Please hear it out before you respond." She didn't sit down. She stood with her arms crossed by the kitchen counter. "Go ahead." "My son has in the last 2 years gone through 11 personal staff. Assistants, coordinators, what you might call handlers. They quit, or he fires them, or on 2 occasions they left for other cities entirely." Carmine's expression didn't change. He has a temper, a deliberate inability to follow schedules, and a distrust of anyone who needs something from him. These qualities make him very good at his work and very difficult to keep alive. "I'm a nurse," Niamh said. "I'm not a bodyguard." "I'm not hiring a bodyguard." Carmine reached into his breast pocket and set an envelope on her kitchen table, right on top of the hydro bill. "I am hiring someone who can keep Riker on schedule, keep him sober during business hours, and keep him from destroying things that cost more than your annual salary to replace. I am hiring someone he will actually listen to." Niamh looked at the envelope. "I've also looked into your brother," Carmine said quietly. "Matteo, he owes $16,000 to a group of people who are running out of patience. I can make that disappear tonight as a signing bonus." Niamh went very still. "The contract inside that envelope," Carmine continued, "is for $8,000 a week, cash, plus a furnished apartment in Yorkville, rent covered. $8,000 a week. She did the math before she could stop herself, and then she made herself stop doing the math, because the math was the point, and she knew it, and he knew it, and they were both standing in the reality of that at the same time. "If he lays a hand on me," Niamh said, "if he ever once lays a hand on me in anger." "Then you leave," Carmine said, "and you keep everything you've earned." Niamh looked at her brother's face in the photograph on the wall. "What exactly do I call myself?" she asked. "Whatever you like," Carmine said. "Riker calls it babysitting. You can correct him." The penthouse was on the 38th floor of a building on Bay Street with views of Lake Ontario that made the grey November sky look like a painting someone had paid too much for. Niamh arrived at 8 in the morning in a new blazer that had been delivered to her apartment by courier. Charcoal grey, good wool, fit perfectly. She held a leather portfolio and her hospital badge out of habit, then put the badge back in her bag. Riker answered the door himself. He was wearing a black sweater and the expression of a man who had not slept and did not plan to discuss it. His arm was in a proper splint now. His eye was healing. He looked at her for a long moment. "You're actually doing this," he said. "Your father is very persuasive," Niamh said. "He offered you money to babysit me." "He offered me money to make sure you show up to things on time and don't end up back in emergency." She walked past him into the apartment. The living room was enormous and expensive, and she noticed had 3 distinct things broken. A lamp, a coffee table leg, and what appeared to have once been a marble bookend. You need to replace the bookend before your 11 o'clock. Riker turned my what? You have a meeting with the Portside Development Board at 11. I've seen your calendar. You've missed the last two. She went to the kitchen and found the espresso machine. It was the kind that cost as much as a used car. Go shower. Wear the charcoal suit, not the navy. The navy reads as a funeral when you're already the most intimidating person in the room. Riker stared at her. They need to negotiate with you, Neve said, hitting the button on the machine. Not surrender to you. There's a difference. You want the deal, not the fear. She glanced back. 15 minutes. He stood there another 2 seconds. Then he went down the hall. Neve gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned pale. 1 hour, she thought, 1 hour at a time. The first 2 weeks were a war of small skirmishes. Riker changed meeting times without telling her. She found out from his driver and showed up anyway. He took his Porsche onto the Gardner Expressway at speeds that made her internal organs rearrange themselves, and she held the door handle and said nothing, because the moment she flinched he would use it. He left documents in disarray, cancelled things without warning, walked out of rooms mid-conversation. She rescheduled, reorganized, followed up. She was relentlessly, quietly present. On the third Wednesday, he told her she was annoying. I know, she said, and kept typing. On the Friday of the second week, she told him to put the whiskey down before a meeting with the union liaison. It's 10:30, he said. It's 10:30, she agreed. Drink the coffee. He put the whiskey down. The thing that changed everything happened on a Thursday night in the distillery district. They had been at a private dinner, a long table of men in expensive suits, discussing things Neve had learned not to look at too directly, the way you didn't look directly at the sun. She stayed at the edge of the room, tracking the schedule on her phone, watching the time. At 11:15, she went to find Riker's driver, a quiet man named Doyle, in the parking structure below. Doyle was in the car. The engine was off. His hands were at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, rigid, and he was sweating in the cold November air. Neve stopped walking. She had learned to trust the thing in her chest that tightened when something was wrong. 6 years in emergency medicine had calibrated it finely. It was tightening now. She went back up the stairs without breaking into a run and went directly to where Riker stood at the bar. We need to leave, she said, low and even. Through the kitchen now. He looked at her. The banter was gone. He saw something in her face. Talk! Your driver is in the car with the engine off and his hands on the wheel. He's sweating. It's 4 degrees outside. 1 second of silence. Then Riker set down his glass and said, very quietly, to the man next to him, take the side door. He put his hand on Neve's arm and steered her toward the kitchen without looking as though anything was wrong. They made it through the kitchen and into the service alley behind the building when the night fell apart. Not literally, but 2 vehicles came in fast from opposite ends of the alley, headlights cutting through the dark, and men poured out of them, and Neve understood with perfect clarity that the word assassinate had just become terrifyingly concrete. Riker's body turned in front of hers. It was automatic, without thought. He used his shoulder to push her back against the brick wall, shielding her, reaching into his jacket. There's a fire exit, 20 meters left, Neve said, because she had looked for exits when they arrived. She always looked for exits. Old ER, habit. There's also a man at 4 o'clock behind the dumpster that your side doesn't see. Riker looked at her. Go, he said, the exit. With you. There was no time to argue. He moved and she moved with him, and everything happened in a compressed sequence of noise and cold air and her own heartbeat very loud in her ears. Something shattered on the wall above her head. She did not stop moving. She reached the exit door and hit it with her shoulder, and they were through, then up a stairwell, then out into the street. They ended up 3 blocks away in the back of a bar that was too loud and too dark for anyone to look twice at them. Riker sat across from her in a booth, his collar undone, breathing evenly despite everything, and looked at her the way he had looked at her in the hospital room, like he was recalibrating something. You told me where the shooter was, he said. He was behind the dumpster. I saw the exhale in the cold air. She pressed her hands flat on the table to stop them trembling. Adrenaline, the body's terrible loyalty to survival. Is Doyle? Doyle made a choice, Riker said, and his voice was flat enough that she understood not to ask anything further. He looked at her for a long time. Outside, the city went on being the city, indifferent and enormous, the way cities always were. You could have run, he said. I know where the exits are, Neve said. Doesn't mean I always use them. He looked at her for a long time, then, there's a place I know. No one else knows about it. The safe house was a flat above a print shop in Kensington Market. It smelled like paper and turpentine and old wood. Riker locked the door with 3 deadbolts and stood very still in the dark for a moment, just breathing. Niamh found a lamp. She found a first aid kit under the bathroom sink, which told her this flat had been used for exactly this kind of thing before. He had a graze on his shoulder. She found it when he took off his jacket. "Sit," she said. He sat. She cleaned the wound in silence. He was very still under her hands, more still than he was when he was trying to control a room. She worked carefully and he let her, and the flat was quiet except for the distant hum of the market outside, that particular neighborhood sound that never quite went away, even at midnight. "Why did you take this job?" Riker asked. "My brother owes money to dangerous people," Niamh said. "That's why you said yes," he said. "That's not why you stayed." She taped the bandage flat and sat back. "Where I grew up, Scarborough, not the TV version. You learn pretty fast that the only people who got out intact were the ones who didn't look away when things got hard." "I don't look away." She met his eyes. "It's not brave. It's just the only thing that works." Riker reached out. His hand, the one not in a splint, rested briefly against her jaw. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was almost tentative, which surprised her more than anything he had done yet. "You're not what I expected," he said quietly. "You're not entirely what I expected either," she said. His phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket and his expression closed like a door. "I have to take this." He stood, the moment folded away, put back somewhere. "We have a bigger problem. My men picked up one of them." The meeting Riker arranged was in a warehouse near the port lands, the kind of building that existed in every large city, for exactly these purposes. Niamh stood near the back wall and tried to be invisible. Carmine Malone was there, leaning on his eagle-headed cane. Beside him stood Gerald Ferris, the family's chief of operations. 30 years with the Malones, a man who wore his loyalty like a second suit. Niamh had met him twice. She had never liked him. She'd never been able to articulate why, and now was not the time to examine it. The man in the chair had a Montreal accent and a split lip, and the specific look of someone who had already calculated what comes next and knows it isn't good. "He was paid," Ferris said, setting a folder on the crate beside Riker. "Took the money 2 weeks ago. He was given the route, the time, the vehicle markings." Ferris glanced at the folder, then at Niamh. He was given the details by someone with access to the schedule. Niamh felt the room change before she understood why. "Only 3 people had the updated schedule," Ferris continued, his voice smooth and measured. "Riker, myself, and the new assistant." He slid 2 photographs onto the crate. One showed Niamh's brother Matteo shaking hands with a man she didn't recognize outside a bar on Sinclair Avenue. The other showed a bank transfer. The date was 5 days ago. Her brother's debt was cleared, Ferris said, not by Mr. Malone Sr., by the organization that sent these men tonight, the same day she took the job. The silence in the warehouse was the kind that made your ears ring. Niamh looked at the photo cold. "That's a lie," she said. "Carmine told me he cleared Matteo's debt as part of my contract." Carmen looked at her. His face was unreadable. "I offered to," he said slowly, "but when I looked into it, the debt was already gone. I assumed you had made your own arrangement." It was a perfect frame, airtight, the kind that had been built carefully over time by someone who understood how evidence worked. "Riker," Niamh stepped forward, her hands shaking. "Look at me. I told you where the shooter was. I moved with you, not away from you. Why would I set this up and then stand in front of it?" Riker had the photographs in his hands. He was not looking at her. "Maybe you got closer than you planned to," Ferris said quietly. "Maybe tonight was about keeping his trust. A classic way to deepen access." Niamh looked at Ferris. She looked at the way he held his hands in front of him, folded, patient. She looked at the expression on his face. Not concerned, not angry, but something underneath those things. Waiting. "You're lying," Niamh said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Those photographs are staged. Look at him." She pointed at Ferris. "He's not worried. He's not angry. He's been waiting for this moment. He's the one who fed the route. He's the one who—" Ferris smiled, the small professional smile of a man being called a liar by someone with no power in the room. Riker set the photographs down. He looked at Niamh, and his face was the closed door again, except harder, more permanent looking. "Get her out of here," he said. "Riker." "I said get her out." He turned away from her, and the movement was so deliberate it was almost worse than anger. 2 men took her arms. She did not fight them. She was walked out of the warehouse and put in the alley on the east side of the building, and the door locked behind her with a heavy, final sound. The alley smelled like the lake. November in Toronto always smelled like the lake when you were outside long enough. mineral and cold and indifferent. Neve stood in it and breathed and made herself think. Matteo, she needed to get to Matteo. She started walking. A black SUV pulled up alongside her before she'd made it half a block. The window came down. Gerald Ferris looked at her from the back seat. "Get in, Neve." "No." "Your brother is at home," Ferris said. "I have 2 people watching his building. You get in, or I make a call." Neve stopped walking. She looked at the SUV. She looked at Ferris, and now she could see it clearly. 30 years, with the Malones. 30 years of running a man's operation and being called a subordinate, and somewhere in the last year, someone had offered him a way out of that. Offered him partnership. Ownership. He'd taken it, and he needed a face to put on the crime. "Get in the car," he said. "You're going to help me make a call to your former employer. Proof of life. He'll come to collect you. He has a hero problem, Riker does." Neve got in. She got in because of Matteo, and because she was doing arithmetic in her head the whole time. She counted turns. She looked at every door they passed, every side street, every light. The facility was a converted shipping container yard near the port. Inside a second building, they put her in a chair in front of a camera on a tripod. 10 minutes, Ferris said to his men. He turned to check the camera equipment. The men hadn't tied her hands. They thought she was just a nurse. They thought this was already over. She spotted the steel folding chair she'd been sitting on. She spotted the camera tripod. She spotted the gap between the 2 guards and the door at the back of the room. One chance. "Ready?" Ferris asked, turning the lens toward her. Neve exploded from the chair. She grabbed it, swung it sideways as hard as she could, and caught the nearest guard in the knee. He went down with a sound that turned her stomach. The second guard reached for her, and she was already moving, pulling the camera tripod from its stand as she turned, and the heavy base caught him across the face with the blunt certainty of 30 pounds of metal. Ferris shouted. She didn't wait to hear what he said. She ran. The yard was a maze of containers, and she went into it immediately, because the maze was the only thing between her and the men now coming behind her. She was small and fast, and she had spent 6 years navigating hospital corridors at speed without hitting anyone. It turned out that skill translated. She found a gap between containers too narrow for a man in a heavy coat, went through it sideways, and came out near the fence. She went over the fence. She felt her palm tear on the chain link and kept moving. She ran until the yard was a shape behind her in the dark, then kept running. A kilometer away, she found a 24-hour Petro-Canada station. The attendant was a teenager who looked up when the door opened and took in her appearance. Blazer torn, no bag, hand bleeding, with the particular blankness of someone who worked overnights and had stopped being surprised by much. "I need to borrow your phone," Neve said. He started to say something about store policy. She put her hands flat on the counter. "Please, I know it's a lot to ask. I will absolutely buy 3 of whatever candy you want. Please." He handed her the phone. She dialed the number she had memorized the first day, Riker's private line, the one that went to no voicemail, no assistant, just him. It rang 4 times. His voice was flat and cold. "It's Neve," she said. "It's Ferris. He's the one. He's been feeding information for months. He set the whole thing up, the photographs, the transfer, everything. He just tried to use me as bait to draw you out, and I escaped. And I need you to believe me, Riker, because I have about 3 minutes before his people find this gas station." Silence. "Neve." His voice had changed. Something cracked at the edges of it. "Where are you?" "Petro-Canada on Cherry Street, dark. Still. And Riker, my brother. Ferris said he has people watching Matteo's building." "I know," Riker said, and his voice was the sound of something enormous and dangerous coming fully awake. "I'm already sending someone. Matteo is safe." A pause. I was wrong. Headlights swept across the window of the station. Black SUV turning into the lot. "They're here," Neve said quite calmly. "Don't let him win." She handed the phone back to the teenager. "Get into the back room," she said. "Lock the door. Don't come out for at least 10 minutes. I'm sorry about this." He stared at her. "Go," she said. He went. She moved through the store, motor oil, soup fluid by the camping display, a long-handled skichi. She was not a violent person. She was, however, a very practical one. When the front door opened, she was at the back. She hit the rear exit, and the wall of cold air hit her face, and her knee screamed, and she put one hand on the brick to catch herself, and looked up. A man was standing at the end of the alley. He raised a rifle. The shot came from somewhere behind her. She turned. Riker's Porsche had jumped the curb at the alley entrance. He was already out of the car. moving toward her with the deliberate speed of a man who had been driving very fast and had not intended to stop for anything. He reached her. He dropped to his knees on the wet asphalt. She noted distantly that his suit trousers were going to be destroyed and pulled her against him. "I sent someone to Matteo," he said. "He's fine, he's safe." His arms were firm around her. She could feel his heartbeat faster than usual, and the faint smell of rain and exhaust and the specific cold of a Toronto November. "You called me." "You were wrong," she said, muffled against his shoulder. "I wanted you to know." "I know was a fool." His voice was rough. "I'm sorry." Behind them, his men moved through the alley with quiet professional efficiency. She heard Ferris's voice rise once and then go silent. She didn't look back. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that followed storms. Not peaceful exactly, but clarified. Ferris had been talking for over a year to an organization with ambitions on the Toronto Port Authority. He had built his case carefully, meticulously, the way men who spent decades in the background built everything, with patience and other people's resources. He had found Matteo's debt and used it as a tool before the Malones ever knew Niamh Callard existed. The photographs were staged. The bank transfer was real, but Ferris had initiated it himself, routing it through Matteo's old account without Matteo's knowledge. Matteo had not sold her. He had been sold, the same as she had. Niamh spent 3 days in Yorkville with her ankle wrapped and her brother sitting in the armchair across from her, not quite meeting her eyes. On the second day, Matteo said, "I didn't know what the money was for. Someone offered to clear the debt, and I gave them my banking information, and I didn't ask enough questions, and I know," Niamh said. "I'm sorry, Niamh, I know what I've cost you." She looked at her brother's face. She remembered being 15 and walking him to school because their mother was working doubles, and their father had been gone 3 years already. She remembered deciding, at 15, that the gap in their family was not going to become a hole that swallowed them both. "You're going to go back to school," she said. "The trades program at the college in Scarborough. You always liked building things." Matteo blinked. It's been years since I know. Go anyway." She handed him the brochure she'd already printed and left on the table 3 days ago. "I already looked into it. They have January intake." He looked at the brochure for a long time. Then he took it. Riker showed up on the 4th day. He didn't call ahead. He knocked 2 quiet raps, which was somehow exactly the right choice. Niamh opened the door and he was standing in the hallway in a coat too light for November, holding 2 coffees from the place on Bloor Street she'd mentioned exactly once in passing. He handed her one. She stepped back and let him in. He sat down on the couch, which was the first time she had ever seen him sit somewhere uninvited without making it feel like a claim. He looked at the apartment, her textbooks on the table, the photograph of her and Matteo at Niagara Falls on the wall, the small specific accumulation of a life she'd been building on her own for a long time. "Ferris has told everything," Riker said. "It's done." "Good." He looked at his coffee cup. "I owe you an apology that's larger than what I said in the alley." "You don't have to." "I do." He looked at her steadily. "I turned my back on you because the evidence was there, and it was easier to believe the evidence than to believe what I actually knew about you. I was afraid of what it meant if I trusted you and I was wrong." He stopped then. "That's not an excuse. I'm telling you so you know I understand what it was." In Niamh's experience, men like Riker Malone did not say things like that, or they said versions of those things that were really other things. But he said it plainly, and plainly was how she understood people. "I know," she said. They sat in the November quiet outside. The city made its constant low hum. The coffee was good. "What happens now?" Niamh asked. "That depends on you," he said. "The position is still there if you want it, and the terms would change. I'm not renegotiating the salary." "Not the salary." He looked at her. "Equal. That's the term. You tell me I'm wrong, I consider it. You tell me to sit down, I sit. You tell me it's tap water and I don't deserve the bubbles." "You always deserve the bubbles," Niamh said. "Just not at 10 in the morning before a meeting." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was pointed firmly in that direction. 6 months later, the private dining room of the Gilt Room on King Street felt different than it usually did. Carmine sat at the head of the table with his eagle-headed cane, and he looked older now, or simply more settled, as though certain weights had shifted to other shoulders. He had formally transferred most of the operation's daily decisions 3 weeks ago. He was, in the careful language of their world, in an advisory capacity. Niamh was there in a dress the color of dark water, not emerald, not navy. Something between, with her hair done and her chin up, and her eyes moving over the room with the same quiet assessment she used everywhere she went. She was not carrying a portfolio. She was not wearing a lanyard. Riker walked in beside her. He wore a suit that fit like it had been made for a man who had decided to occupy the room rather than fill it, and his posture was the kind that came from actually meaning to be somewhere. His arm had healed. The cut above his eye was a faint, thin line. The room adjusted itself when they walked in. Shoulders shifted. Conversations paused. Eyes moved toward them and then down, not in fear exactly, in the specific acknowledgement of where the center of gravity had moved. A young server approached, clearly new, clearly recalculating his entire evening. He had a bottle of wine and the expressions of someone doing very difficult arithmetic. Mr. Malone, the server managed. Mrs. Callard. Riker sat down. He looked at the wine. He looked at the server who had started to sweat. Relax, Riker said, and his voice had the tone of a man who had learned. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely, the difference between commanding a room and crushing it. We're just here for dinner. The server exhaled so hard the candle on the table flickered. Neve touched Riker's arm and he turned to look at her. She held up her water glass. Still, please, she said to the server. Sparkling, Riker, for her, she's earned it. Still is fine. Sparkling, Riker said, in the tone of a man who planned to win exactly this one argument and no others tonight. Neve set her glass down. Carmine, at the head of the table, was watching them both with an expression she had come to recognize over 6 months, the satisfaction of someone whose plan had worked out better than even they had anticipated. She looked at the room, the politicians, the developers, the men who moved things in this city. She looked at Riker, reading the menu with the focused attention he brought to everything. She had arrived at this table as a nurse who could not pay her hydro bill. She was still a nurse. She planned to stay one. But the woman who had walked into that hospital suite at 2 a.m., with aching feet and 0 patients left, had not imagined sitting here, in this dress, with the city laid out below like an argument she'd already won. She hadn't tamed anyone. She hadn't changed anyone. She had stood her ground, and someone had finally turned out to be worth standing it beside. The sparkling water arrived. She picked up the glass. To the impossible, Riker said quietly, for her alone. Neve touched her glass to his. To the ordinary, she said. Turns out it's stronger.